No cost too great. Why China will invade Taiwan. The purpose of this presentation is mainly to attack the argument used by the Allies and in the free world media that by imposing costs on China, it will not attack Taiwan. My argument is largely from a China-centric view and the idea that these costs really are not too great for the following reasons. In China's opinion, they have every right to attack Taiwan, or rather, reunify it. This is tied up with my last video, the national humiliation narrative. The narrative there is extremely useful because it's the idea that foreigners set out to humiliate China, and it completely ignores the internal weaknesses of the Qing dynasty. As the debate often goes about Scottish independence, the economic reasons for Scotland going independent are extremely weak. It would become generally a poorer country. To which people always reply, but why did so many people die in that battle in Braveheart? Similarly with China, the national humiliation narrative really deflects any internal analysis, internal self-criticism of China's own weaknesses regarding why the foreigners invaded. At the same time, it's not a debate in China whether they should reunify or not. It's just not a debate. They are doing it. It is going to happen soon, within the next 5 to 10 years. That is the general feeling of every Chinese on the street in China. They will reunify Taiwan. And this indoctrination means the reaction is so fierce in the West when we talk about preventing this reunification. At the same time, in the grand arc of history, China feels that Taiwan was originally within its own sphere of influence, and that the idea is now that America's strength is waning, it is legitimate that China can exert more control within its own backyard. I think this sort of grand scheme of history argument slightly ignores the contemporary realities. It also does something of a disservice to the American security umbrella that has permitted China to get rich, and all the reform of the last 40 years would have been impossible unless America had given China a huge helping hand. So they have this divine right feeling that they should take it back. Secondly, China will largely have power without limits. This means that they have built themselves up strong enough that they don't have to rely on any other international forces and international opinion at the same time. They are completely independent of it. In terms of sort of structural realism, China really is in a strong position to reunify Taiwan. They've obviously got the most soldiers. They've got the biggest navy, a navy equivalent in number of ships to America. And whereas America has to police the world, China has simply one job to do with all those ships: take back Taiwan. So very much I feel like the military balance is on their side. And I think within China, this would be the argument as well. They've got the strength, so what are they waiting for? Similarly, in terms of hard power, it goes beyond things like army and navy. They've also got space technology, the ability potentially to take out satellites. They've also got cyber, which I believe will be the key part to the war. And all of these combine to give China a serious edge over any foreigners who try to protect Taiwan. And I think the idea of a possible war is that it will go further than a simple sort of hardware war, aircraft carrier to aircraft carrier in the South China Sea. China's aim from a cyber perspective will be to completely disrupt domestic critical infrastructure of any countries opposing it when it tries to reunify Taiwan. This, for example, would be jamming the onboard computer systems of military hardware, aircraft carriers, jets that might try to fight against China's invasion. At the same time, it will be domestic targets like banks. China will disrupt banking. I believe this is exactly what they did to Australia shortly after Australia demanded an independent inquiry into COVID. They shut down Australian banks for a whole weekend. So this is where they will have that critical edge. And China believes it's strong enough. And bear in mind the state capacity that China has, particularly I feel like in human resources, that they can manage a war on all these different fronts much faster just because they've got more people doing it. And a good example of that state capacity is all the quarrels that China picked with various countries around its fringes during the spring of 2020. At the same time, China has extremely strong finance and trade levers. Being the number one trading partner to over 130 countries in the world means that in the event of a war, it could use these levers to prevent countries coming on the wrong side of China. The question mark there is, even though China could use those trade things, allies against it could blockade China, the Straits of Malacca being particularly vulnerable. And at the same time, China's land borders might be under threat if it decides to go for Taiwan. What about India? What about Russia creeping around the edges? But in terms of trade, the possible limitations on China's strength are oil and food. China is neither energy nor food secure, but last time I checked, they have enough supplies for at least a year of complete cut-off from the rest of the world. Bear in mind, with a possible war, they would still potentially have supply lines through Pakistan and could open up a route through Bangladesh or Burma. So, other reasons the war looks inevitable. The party has effectively promised it. It's tied its own legitimacy to the aim to reunite Taiwan. Even the most liberal of CCP politicians in recent years, Wen Jiabao, said in a statement similar to, I believe it was Queen Mary in England, that on his heart was written Taiwan, and that it would be the greatest thing he ever saw if it were reunified. And this ties into the nationalism trap I spoke of last time, which is the vicious circle that the people want Taiwan to be reunified. The hardliners in the party agree with this. They put pressure on the leadership. Unless the leadership wants to keep its job, they have to go and do it. And that pressure just mounts and mounts. So far, I would argue the CCP has been extremely effective in controlling public opinion. They really know how to open and close the valve, but faced with potential domestic problems that could lead to inflaming the tensions with outside problems. At the same time, I would argue Xi Jinping is very much a preventive actor, as has been shown in his actions in Xinjiang, also in Hong Kong. The idea is he doesn't like a problem to fester or get out of control. He will go in invasively and fix it before it becomes a problem. Similarly, the whole concept of common prosperity. It's the idea he is trying to tackle the problems before they become major ones. Similarly, with Taiwan, I think that's the situation. Turning a moment to domestic economic problems, I would highly recommend George Magnus's book Red Flags, where he looks at the core problems of debt, demography, the middle income trap, and the renminbi exchange rate. But I think while those weigh the country down, they are not necessarily critical quite yet. I will do a presentation on the book in more detail in the future. I think where the domestic economic problems really lie are in the switch that Xi Jinping is now enacting, moving from capitalism towards the concept of common prosperity. In communist terms, this is the idea they've gone through the capitalist phase of development and are now embarking on true socialism. But the structural shifts involved in the economy to turn it from the property growth driven one to a more consumer and services one are substantial and face down a lot of vested interests. Not to say the Chinese people themselves, who all own a lot of property, and the great risk about this shifting away from property is that property values will collapse. And I think the idea with the party so far has been, the deal's been growth, increasing wealth, plus no freedom. Now that the trade-off is limited growth, no freedom, and a complete shift in what reality is. The common prosperity theme, the idea that they've got to accept lower growth at the same time as a form of social democracy. I think it will be hard to persuade the people to put up with this. Nevertheless, it's a completely repressive country where people are extremely obedient. If they don't believe what the party says, they're going to get beaten up. So it might work out. However, the point being that if there is domestic stagnation or trouble, how do you distract? Well, have a war. And the idea of taking back Taiwan would not just distract from domestic problems, but really be an everlasting glory that would crown China's return to the international fore. Now, the reasons for my argument may sound highly CCP apologist here, but I feel like I'm shining a light on the dark realities of the totalitarian system and a realist light on the structure of things. There's a lot of wishful thinking in liberal democracies that it's some sort of debate in China whether to reunify Taiwan or not. It is not a debate. It is happening. They want to do it. There's no argument here. And I don't blame liberal democracies. We like to have debates, and we think kind of reasonably that we project those that way of thinking onto other nations. Bear in mind, in China, there really is no debate here. There is no choice. And I think the great question for liberal democracies is, if China invaded, would they be willing to counterattack, bearing in mind that a counterattack would really involve an invasion of the mainland as well. Effectively, you would have to get rid of the CCP regime. It's a huge undertaking, and whereas Taiwan is a small island with 23 million, it's a possibly doable target. Trying to head into the mainland with 1.3, 1.4 billion, that is another question. And would democratic populations really be willing to go and do that? I think it's a tough question. However, one of the risks China faces, and a lack of control with its own nationalism narrative, is they might not stop with Taiwan. Speak to many young Chinese, and they harbour every desire to take Taiwan and then Japan as well. And I think if Japan were invaded, then that would justify and would actually provide the incentive, the enragement that would mean the West and other liberal democracies, other Asian democracies, would fight back. So that is the sort of note. Don't be wishful thinking about it. It's more likely to happen than not. Reaching my final points, remember it is a personal thing for Xi. He has mentioned it in his speeches that he wants to see Taiwan reunited. So it's a personal issue. It means he's tied his job to it. If he doesn't do it, he's out of a job, if not a life, because hardliners will take over. As with almost everything in Chinese politics, it comes back to that legitimacy question. If they don't do this stuff, then there's a risk that they might be thrown out. And I think the other point to note is that for many individual Chinese, it's personal. It's such a patriotic thing. And bear in mind that China does not care how many people die. It does not care. In a country of 1.4 billion, they have more than enough people. So attacking Taiwan is a cost they can bear. They don't remember it is a totalitarian dictatorship. They do not care about people's lives. They will throw millions of bodies to fix that problem, because the glory of taking back Taiwan will be worth every drop of blood shed. You have to understand what an emotive issue it is in China. So, on that cheery note, the question is there any way to climb down from this? Is there any way to stop this spiralling out of control? Is there any cost too great that foreigners outside China can impose to prevent the CCP invading Taiwan? I believe, for the reasons I've set out, it is highly unlikely. And the fact that China is choosing to isolate itself from the world, retreat into its own shell, means that they are becoming more and more cut off, and that the groupthink, the social theory of categorization, will steer them towards the extreme. And that means there would be no cost too great. Bear in mind, the Chinese are extremely good planners, mathematicians, accountants. They've run the numbers. They probably know what they could risk to get it back. So overall, I think there is no cost too great that could stop China from taking back Taiwan. What are your thoughts? Let me know.